Okay, we'll go.
All right. So Karl Marx um, had the idea of writing this big book in 4 volumes, uh, which he was going to call Das Kapital in German, which is capital in English, since we don't use as many um, definite articles as the Germans do. And it's a very interesting book. Certainly, it's a great book, and I think it's worth reading. Um, but there are a few problems with it. So, just to lay the groundwork, uh, Marx uses terms in his own peculiar way, and most of the time, I translate what he says into more conventional economic um, language. But he does. It's worth pointing out that he does. Um, he has the term use value, which is roughly the same as, well, more or less the same as what regular economists would call utility. In other words, it's a subjective want that is fulfilled by some commodity that is produced. He talks about exchange value, by which he means equilibrium price. He's very little concerned with short-term movements in prices. And when he talks about exchange value, he's usually talking about equilibrium price. Um, but then he has the term value, which is different from both of those. And value is defined by Marx as socially necessary labor time. So it's measured in hours, and it's a kind of average because some workers produce more in an hour than other workers, but you sort of average it out. So he has this concept of socially necessary labor time, which is absolutely crucial to his entire analysis. Um, so in volume one, he planned to write this 4 volume work. Only volume one appeared under his own direction in his lifetime, and that volume one of Capital, which appeared in 1867. The other volumes were produced some years after his death. So volumes 2 and 3 was produced by Engels, who was his collaborator and financial backer, some years after his death. And then the 4th volume, which is usually called Theories of Surplus Value, which is a kind of retrospective on all previous theories of political economy. That appeared even later. He's mainly famous for his theory of surplus value. When Engels gave the oration at Marx's graveside in 1883, he said that Marx had 2 great achievements for which it will always be remembered. One is the materialist conception of history, and the other is the theory of surplus value. So it's very important in the system of thought we call Marxism. So the theory of surplus value tries to explain how there's something distracting happening on the screen now that I'm going to have to
Okay.
make it go away.
Take your time because we can edit that out.
So it was just distracting because it was a huge thing over my face, and I do like to see my face. So anyway, so Marx held the view that workers are exploited under capitalism, not occasionally and in rare extreme instances, but as a regular part of the way capitalism operates.
Can I interrupt you at that point?
Yes, yes.
So, in discussing theories, it's always useful, I suppose, that to look at the original problem that's what is the urgency of the theory? What is it trying to resolve? Was it that Marx set out to show scientifically that the worker within capitalism was being exploited? Is this the prompt or the puzzle that generates his theory of surplus value?
Well, there are two ways to answer that, I suppose. One is, what does Marx say was his purpose, but then we could
Mm.
try and go behind that and look deeper. What Marx says is that he's trying to account for profit. So if you're a capitalist, you've got a pile of money, so you invest in a factory, you pay a lot of workers, and lo and behold, you get a regular income from selling the goods in that factory. And Marx says, what is the source of that profit, which he calls surplus value? And he, so what motivated him to take this approach? I think that it becomes a psychological thing. Uh, but anyway, let's leave that for the moment. So he thinks that the source of this profit is unpaid labor. In other words, if you read Marx, it's quite clear there is a moral disapprobation here. There is. He thinks there is something morally culpable about.
However, it's only insinuated though, isn't it?
Right, right. But
Yeah.
it's quite clear that he thinks it's a morally bad thing
Mm.
that is happening. Now, I think most Marxists that you talk to would say, "Oh, that's just for literary effect," or they'd say something like that,
Mm.
and they'd say that they would say it's an objective claim about capitalism. So he thinks that exploitation, it takes the form of unpaid labor. Um, and he often compares the wage worker under capitalism with the slave under a system of chattel slavery. So the slave is provided with his keep by the slave owner, and so the slave owner has the expense of providing food, clothing, and shelter for the slaves. But obviously, the slave owner calculates that he will come out ahead because the goods produced will be exceed in value what it costs to maintain the slaves. And so Marx has the same idea about wage slaves under capitalism. So what they get paid in their wages is enough to keep body and soul together. It's their subsistence, but they can produce more than their subsistence, and that is pocketed by the capitalists. So this is Marx's picture of exploitation under capitalism. Now, he frequently refers, or consistently refers, to the workers' income, the workers' wages, as subsistence. Now, obviously, there is a problem here because even in Marx's day, most workers were getting several times biological subsistence. You know, I've actually had arguments with various Marxists about this over the years, and if you get to the point where you're saying that a worker in London in the 19th century who had a piano in the house and some sheet music and would often, like, it was the counterpart of today's hi-fi, right? Is the piano, which a lot of workers had in 19th century England. That this is part of the subsistence, because without that piano, the worker wouldn't be in the right frame of mind to go out and produce widgets for the capitalist, right? So, but this is obviously a little bit strange.
Mm.
So the meaning of the word subsistence, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but you could dwell on it at great length. And I've concluded, after thinking about this for many years, that the only empirical point you can get from this is that the wage is less than the selling price of the product, right?
Yeah.
So the capitalist has various expenses and he pays the workers, and he sells the goods for more than he's paid the workers, and that's his profit.
Mm.
So, of course, that's been known for thousands of years. There were capitalists in ancient Sumer 5,000 years ago, and they knew that that they had to sell the goods for more than what they paid the workers. Right? That's not a new discovery in the 19th century.
Mm.
So it's worth
It,
it's worth saying that subsistence is a very treacherous term, and it certainly can't be taken literally. Um, Now, Marx also says the lot of the worker, the condition of the worker will, over time, get worse. But then there are saving clauses. So he says, be his payment high or low, his condition must grow worse. Well,
yeah.
if the payment is high, what is being said here? So some people say it's relative to the capitalist or whatever. But so there are a lot of these terms which have a rhetorical impact, but it's difficult to empirically quantify them. So, but I think all you can say, what you're left with, is that Marx recognizes that the selling price of the product has to be higher than the wage bill, right?
Yes.
In fact, it has to be
It
higher
is.
than all the expenses of the capitalist, including capital equipment
Mm.
uh, and the wage bill, because the capitalist wants a return on his investment. So this is
It is.
pretty vacuous, in fact. You're not
However,
learning
to just be
you're not learning anything about the
trying,
determination of wages.
however, trying to be fair to Marx, it is a distinctive feature of all organisms that we know. I mean, the human being is the only one that can create more than it consumes, um,
Right,
and that's one of the reasons why, for example, panics over overpopulation were, well, exactly, they were exaggerated. I mean,
right, right.
you
Well,
know,
I
human
think some
beings are
animals.
often have often been portrayed as like like flies in a container with just a certain amount of sugar.
Mhm.
The population expands rapidly in consuming the sugar, but then completely collapses because it's not able to sustain that population
Right,
cannot
right.
sustain itself. And human beings are very different in that respect. Hence, there is some insight there with this idea of labor as such, as in performance, and labor power, the ability to perform labor.
Yes, yes. Um, I think Marx thinks that he solved the problem of surplus value um, by a point he makes, which is a purely semantic point, is that in his view, the worker is not paid for his labor. I'm using the word his to mean hers. Um, uh, the worker is not paid for his labor, but he's paid for what Marx called his labor power. And what that means is his capacity to labor.
Yeah,
And what that means is subsistence. So the distinctive point is that Marx is saying depends upon this idea of subsistence. But
yes,
when all
yes.
is said and done, all we can say about the workers' wages, since many workers today are getting hundreds or even thousands of times what would be their subsistence. What all we can say about this is that the price of the product is greater than the wage bill.
Mm.
That's it, and we know that already. We knew that thousands of years ago. So uh, I
Okay.
don't I don't think there is much to. I could also say that you could turn it round and say that the worker is exploiting the capitalist because um, the capitalist doesn't get the entire product of his capital, right? That you could do that, and that would be about as convincing as the idea that the worker doesn't get the whole output of his labor. So I don't think that Marx's theory of surplus value was actually a great discovery. I think it's an empty wordplay. there is no upper limit to the incomes of workers. Um, and so, well, we can come back to that. One of the odd things about Marx, so the most distinctive thing about his theory of political economy, when you compare it with Ricardo or J.S. Mill or any of his contemporaries or predecessors, is that he thinks that capital equipment cannot create new value. Only labor, only what he calls living labor, actual workers working and doing something, only that can produce new value. So let's say we combine a worker and a machine. In Marx's view, the price of the machine represents the labor that went into producing the machine. And as it's used up and worn out, it confers that part of its value to the product, but it doesn't create any new value, whereas the worker is creating new value all the time. This, I think, is an arbitrary assumption. There is no basis for it in reality. We see that capital equipment gets a return in the market, just as labor does, and I don't see any basis for making that distinction. But one of the odd consequences of this approach of Marx's is what's called the transformation problem. If you take volume 1, and for that matter, volume 2 of Capital, you would predict, and Marx does point out that this is the resulting prediction, you would predict that labor-intensive industries would have higher rates of return than capital-intensive industries, since capital doesn't create any new value. All new value comes from living labor. So Marx calls capital dead labor, right? So in Marx's view, living labor alone creates new value. And therefore, all the surplus is created by the living labor, and none of it is created by the dead labor. This is a very, very.
Sorry, David.
No, that's all right. Go.
Yeah, there's something almost mystical about this labor or labor value that behind the appearances that for Marx is determining the value of things.
Right.
So
I think that yes.
But he thought for that reason that it was analogous to a scientific approach.
Right. He did very definitely think that. I think in my view, Marx thought of socially necessary labor time, which is value in his theory. He thought of this as being somewhat analogous to mass in physics.
Yes.
You know, in physics, you have something called mass, which frequently contradicts everyday common sense observation, right? A helium balloon has mass. It doesn't have negative mass, and yet it flies up into the sky instead of falling to the ground. So there are all these anomalies in relating the concepts of physics to our everyday experience. And of course, there is a simple explanation for that, which is the fact that we're surrounded by air, and if things are lighter than air, then they will rise, even though they have mass. But so Marx, I think, this is his approach. He thinks of value as something that he has identified, which is like mass in physics.
Yes.
It explains observable reality without corresponding with observable reality. What this means is that in volumes 1 and 2, Marx assumes that values determine price, and they directly correspond with price. But he's left with this problem. He's left with this problem called the transformation problem. Because if we look at reality, we don't find that labor-intensive industries have higher rates of return than capital-intensive industries. In fact, we can see that it must be the case that there is a powerful tendency for the rate of return on capital to be the same in all industries, whether they're labor intensive or capital intensive, right? Because capital is constantly being moved from areas of lower than average rate of return to areas of higher than average rate of return. Unless there is some barrier that's preventing this, like giving huge, I don't know what you would call them, but giving huge bounties to big pharma, uh, uh, giving them these patents and then allowing them to make billions by forcing people to take their products. That would be, that would explain why big pharma has a higher rate of return. If it does, I haven't looked recently.
Or something like a protective tariff for a particular
Yes, right.
company or industry,
Yeah,
or a monopoly
right.
grant from government.
Yeah, there would have to be some element of monopoly. Otherwise, you would expect, and you do in fact observe, generally speaking, that all industries have about the same rate of return. And if one industry is like in a slump, it's usually temporary. But if it's more than temporary, it means that there will be a cutback in output in that industry, and that leads to a higher rate of return. Right? A smaller output, but given the investment, a higher rate of return. So there is a constant tendency in the market for rates of return to be equalized. And Marx fully acknowledges this. This wasn't something he stumbled into. He says that what we're saying here in volume one contradicts all experience, but we're going to answer that in a later volume. And of course, he answered it in volume three, which didn't come out until some years after his death. So there was this period where people said, I wonder what Marx's answer could be. And this is called the transformation problem. Now, the transformation problem is insoluble because Marx wanted the transformation problem to show that the rate of surplus value, or the amount of surplus value, is the same as the amount of profit. And that is not what we see. And when we do the math, we don't find that they're equal amounts. We find that they differ. So in that sense, the transformation problem as a mathematical exercise is insoluble, and a refutation of Marx's theory as he intended it. But that I don't think is of any huge significance. What I think is of huge significance is why would you want to do this operation instead of going directly to the observable facts? The observable facts are that there is a rate of return which is the same in all industries, and it applies to the total capital invested, irrespective of how much the percentages that goes to wages and how much goes to capital equipment. For the sake of this kind of discussion, we can treat land as just another form of capital, right? We don't have to make a distinction. And now one thing you have to understand about Marx is that, and his book Capital, is that in the 1870s there was a revolution in economic theory. Nothing to do with Marx, and it's controversial how much Marx was aware of these new trends in economic thinking. And it's called the marginal revolution or marginalist revolution. And it was propagated by William Stanley Jevons in England, by Karl Menger in Vienna, and by Léon Walras in France. So the three of them independently came up with versions of marginalism. And the general view among economists is that this renders obsolete and irrelevant the kind of approach used by Marx. And I agree with that. I'm in agreement with. I hate to say it because I have a reputation of being someone who's always trying to be different, but I do agree with the great majority of the economics profession about this. I think that it's pointless trying to salvage something from Marx, because we do have neoclassical theory. Neoclassical theory originally in the 1870s developed a new theory of demand. And out of that, some years later, arose what we call marginal productivity theory. And I think marginal productivity theory is the correct theory of price determination. And it shows that labor gets a return, capital gets a return. They both get a return. And the return is their marginal product. So therefore, it means that the whole Marxian approach is misguided, because it's a fact that an observable fact that capital equipment adds to output and gets a return that is its marginal product, just the same as labor does. So I think that disposes of Marx. Now, let me see, I was going to mention a couple of other things here. There is one thing that I would point out about Marx's approach is when it comes down to empirical application, it's very heavily dependent on letting the market work its wonders.
Mm.
So, for example, one obvious problem with the labor theory of value is what's called the reduction problem. Some workers produce a lot more in an hour in different lines of work. I'm not talking about difference of competence here, but just, a dentist produces far more in an hour than a ditch digger. That might not have been true in the 18th century, but it's true today. Mm. So you have to somehow average out all these different hours of labor. And Marx says that this reduction is accompanied by the market. It is accomplished, by the market. So here you have the market called in to do some wonderful stuff, reconciling the problems with the labor theory of value. And Marx relied upon market processes to do things. Whenever he got in a corner, he said, the market takes care of this. So I'm going to read this passage, which I think, when I first read this many, many decades ago, I was quite stunned by it, because I was a Marxist at the time and I was trying to grasp what Marx was on about. Mm. So this is what he says. Suppose that every piece of linen in the market contains no more labor time than is socially necessary. In spite of this, all these pieces, taken as a whole, may have had superfluous labor time spent upon them. If the market cannot stomach the whole quantity at the normal price, this proves that too great a portion of the total labor of the community has been expended in the form of weaving. So what Marx is saying is we don't know what socially necessary labor time is until the market tells us.
Yes.
Now, it's this is quite astounding, really. But on the other hand, it's on one level, it's a relief, because if Marx was to have said that the labor actually expended upon a product is what creates its price, that would have been obviously a blunder. It's clear that you don't increase the price of something by spending more labor on it. And in fact, the labor expended in the past upon creating a product has absolutely nothing to do with how it will sell today. Nothing. Yes. It's totally irrelevant. Or as Jevons put it, bygones are forever bygones. And so the fact that Marx has that passage, it's that only isolated passage, that one passage in Volume 1 of Capital, saves him from that big blunder. But what it does mean is that what we thought was something to do with labor turns out to be something to do with market demand, what the market can stomach. So it greatly weakens the idea that there is some alternative to the marginalist or neoclassical position.
So basically, by doing that, he's reversed the cause-effect relationship that he's talking about.
Well, it's a pity we can't interrogate him about what he was admitting when he wrote that passage. But it raises the question whether you have to understand that Marx was absolutely committed to the total abolition of the market. There would be no buying and selling in a communist society, none. So anything that is done by the markets cannot be done in a communist society unless there is some other way of doing it. So the question arises then, if the market tells you what socially necessary labor time is, would a communist administration have a way different to the market of finding out what socially necessary labor time would be? And I would say no. But anyway, no one has ever suggested anything that comes close. So the next point I want to get to is that Capital, the book by Marx, volume one of Capital especially, is not simply a book about the way capitalism works, although that's the way it presents itself. It is an argument for the inevitability of communism replacing capitalism. And this is made very clear in chapter 32 of volume one. In some editions, it's the last chapter. In some editions, it isn't. I won't go into that. But chapter 32 of volume one of Capital argues that capitalism must inevitably and soon give way to communism. And communism will be a system with no market, with no buying and selling. Marx argues that this is inevitable. I maintain that not only is it not inevitable, it's impossible. There can never be a communist system as described by Marx. And the reason is what comes out of the economic calculation debate that was started by Ludwig von Mises in 1920, that a communist system, or as by that time they started calling it a socialist system, would not have any way of accurately costing the factors of production, and therefore it would be unable to plan coherently